The sharp sound of the pistol shot was like a knife cutting through the peaceful landscape. Marcus Jones, a tall black man, froze in the middle of the black asphalt. His face, usually calm and resolute, was now distorted by an unbelievable pain and shock. He staggered back a step, his left hand reflexively clutching his stomach, where his shirt was quickly soaked with a dark red. Fresh blood began to seep out, dripping and spreading across the clean pavement. His right hand still held loosely the cell phone he had just pulled out of his jacket pocket. His eyes were wide open, staring straight at the white policeman standing a few steps away, as if asking a silent question. Then the strength left him. He fell to his knees and collapsed completely to the ground. Not a groan, only weak, gasping breaths. Officer Daniel Hansen stood there, his Glock 19 still cocked, a wisp of smoke rising lazily from the hot barrel. His face was a strange mix. There was still anger, the twisted satisfaction of exercising power, but there was also confusion, a belated shock as his brain began to process the image of the man lying motionless in a pool of blood at his feet. He had just shot a man. He knew he was in trouble, but at that moment he had no idea of the magnitude of the shockwave he had just unleashed. Just an hour before the tragedy, Marcus Jones's shiny black Lexus ES350 was rolling smoothly down the interstate, heading toward Oakmont. Inside, the cool air from the air conditioning contrasted with the warm, late autumn afternoon outside. Marcus 50 had just finished a long, stressful week at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. He was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, a senior staff officer who had spent nearly 3 decades in the military. His career had been filled with impressive accomplishments, difficult assignments overseas, and quiet contributions to national security. He was respected by his colleagues for his intelligence, iron discipline, and natural leadership. But this weekend, he wasn't Lieutenant Colonel Jones, the strategist. He was simply Marcus, the dutiful son on his way to visit his aging mother, Martha, who had been living alone in the upscale Summit Ridge Estates neighborhood since her husband, a prominent lawyer, had died a few years earlier. He'd called ahead, promising to stop by her favorite bakery on the way home to pick up the strawberry shortcake she'd always talked about. He smiled at the thought of her delight at seeing him and his little gift. He put on a classic jazz CD, the familiar tunes helping him unwind after the short flight from Washington, D.C. The Lexus turned onto the private roads of Summit Ridge Estates. It was a world away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Million-dollar mansions were nestled behind large, meticulously manicured gardens. The streets were spotless and quiet, save for the occasional luxury car. Wealth, privacy, and order were almost absolute. Marcus slowed down, strictly adhering to the 25 mph speed limit. He drove carefully, conscious of the quietness of the neighborhood. Unbeknownst to him, his presence in the luxury car had caught the eye of Officer Daniel Hansen of the Oakmont Police Department, who was on his afternoon patrol in the area. Hansen, a white man in his 40s, carried deep-seated racial prejudices, though he rarely admitted them publicly. To Hansen, a black man driving an expensive car in an affluent, all-white neighborhood like Summit Ridge was a red flag. He didn't care who the person was, what he did, or whether he had a legitimate reason to be there. The color of his skin and the car were enough to set off his biased alarm mechanism. "Look," Hansen muttered to himself in the patrol car as the Lexus passed in the opposite direction. "There he is again. He must be here to do something illegal, drug dealing or maybe theft. Let's check it out." Without hesitation, without any traffic violation, Hansen immediately turned the wheel, turned his Ford Interceptor utility around, and stepped on the accelerator to follow the Lexus. He turned on the red and blue hazard lights mounted on the roof of the car, clearly signaling the car in front to stop. Marcus Jones glanced in his rearview mirror, seeing the flashing red and blue lights approaching. He let out a small sigh, a flicker of annoyance in his voice. He knew he hadn't been speeding or doing anything else. Maybe it was just a random check, or had the out-of-state license plate intrigued the officer. Either way, he knew the procedure. With the calmness of a trained officer, he signaled a right turn, slowed down, and pulled the Lexus neatly to the side of the road, stopping in the shade of a large maple tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn a brilliant orange. He turned off the engine, rolled down the driver's window about a half-inch, and placed his hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 o'clock positions, the standard position to show cooperation and no intention of aggression. He waited for the police officer to approach. Officer Hansen stopped the patrol car a few meters from the back of the Lexus, a textbook safe distance. But the way he got out of the car was anything but professional. He slammed the car door shut, his gait somewhat arrogant, his right hand never leaving the Glock holster at his side. He walked slowly toward the Lexus, his eyes scanning the expensive car with suspicion and a hint of undisguised envy. He stopped right next to the driver's window, bent down to look inside. "License and registration," Hansen said bluntly, his voice curt, without a greeting, without a name or license plate number, without a reason for the stop. The most basic of traffic stop procedures that every police officer is taught. Marcus Jones, though clearly feeling the disrespect, responded politely and calmly. His voice was deep and clear, without a trace of fear or anxiety. "Hello, officer. Is there a problem? Did I do something wrong?" Hansen didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he looked Jones straight in the face, his gaze scanning him from head to toe, lingering on his smart but not overly formal attire. "The point is, you're here," he said, his voice starting to take on a tone of challenge and contempt. "What the hell are you doing in Summit Ridge Estates? This isn't your place. Give me your papers, quick." The officer's rudeness and baseless accusations shocked and angered Marcus Jones. He had traveled the world and encountered all kinds of situations, but being treated like a criminal in a peaceful neighborhood in his own country just because of the color of his skin was unacceptable to him. However, military discipline was ingrained in his blood. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, not letting his emotions get the better of him. He knew that confronting an agitated officer could make things worse. He slowly reached into the glove compartment in front of the passenger seat and pulled out a brown leather wallet in a neatly clipped sheaf of documents. "I'm on my way to see my mother, officer," he explained again, still trying to sound calm. "She lives down the road in a house on Oak Lane. Here's my driver's license and registration and insurance." He carefully handed them to Hansen through the window. Hansen snatched the papers from Jones's hand, his demeanor arrogant. He flipped through the driver's license, saw the name Marcus Aurelius Jones and a permanent address of Alexandria, Virginia. "Oh, Virginia," Hansen said sarcastically, handing the papers back to Jones. "So far away. What are you doing here? Visiting Mom? That sounds suspicious. Or are you here to snoop around to see if there are any vulnerable houses to report to your friends?" He sneered, an ugly smile that betrayed his contempt. At this point, Marcus Jones's tolerance limit was broken. He could no longer remain silent in the face of these blatant insults and baseless accusations. "Officer," his voice became cold and hard, no longer showing any sign of concession. "Your attitude and words are completely unacceptable. You are abusing your authority and acting in an unprofessional, discriminatory manner. I have done nothing wrong. I demand that you stop this immediately and let me go." The blunt, authoritative words of a man accustomed to giving orders and being respected like Jones added fuel to the fire of Hansen's pride and prejudice. He felt challenged, lectured by a black man he despised. His face was red with anger. "You dare to order me around? Who do you think you are? I suspect you, understand? Get out of this damn car. Hurry! I want to check for drugs or weapons," he shouted, his right hand repeatedly tapping the Lexus window, making threatening noises. Marcus Jones looked directly into Hansen's glaring eyes. He realized the situation was becoming dangerous. The officer was clearly losing control and acting on pure prejudice. Staying in the car would be considered uncooperative and could even invite Hansen to break the window or take more violent action. He made a snap decision, one that he believed would de-escalate the situation and demonstrate his cooperation. Get out of the car and confront the situation calmly and openly. Perhaps being outside, in front of onlookers, would force the officer to be more restrained. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He calmly turned off the car and unbuckled his seatbelt. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, standing straight next to his shiny black Lexus, facing Officer Hansen directly. He looked straight at Hansen, his eyes steady. "Okay, officer, I've gotten out of the car as you requested. Now what do you want?" Marcus Jones's calm and dignified exit from the car did not appease Officer Hansen as he had hoped. On the contrary, it seemed to fuel his aggression. He felt superior now that the subject was outside the protective space of the car. He took a step forward, almost pressing against Jones, invading his personal space, continuing to spew out insults, his voice filled with spite and hatred. "I want you out of this neighborhood right now. You hear me? You don't belong here. This is a neighborhood for decent people, white people, not for dirty niggers like you." The blatant, unadulterated racism finally made Marcus Jones realize that any attempt to reason with this man was futile. Officer Hanson's actions had gone far beyond mere unprofessionalism. They were a blatant abuse of power, fueled by deep-seated hatred and prejudice. He could not let this go unchecked. He needed to document the incident, report it to Hanson's superiors. He needed to protect his civil rights. He looked Hanson straight in the eye, his voice firm and cold, no longer trying to hide his righteous indignation. "Officer, your behavior is illegal and unacceptable. I will not tolerate this insult. I will record this entire conversation as evidence, and I will call my attorney right now." With that, Marcus Jones reached into the inside of his light sports jacket toward the inside breast pocket where he usually kept his cell phone. It was a completely natural, calm gesture, not at all abrupt or threatening. He simply wanted to take out his phone to do what he had just said. But for Officer Daniel Hanson, who was consumed by rage and delusions of prejudice, the action was interpreted in the worst possible way. Or perhaps he was just waiting for an excuse, however flimsy, to escalate the violence, to teach this nigger a lesson. "What are you doing?" Hanson shouted, his voice cracking with excitement and possibly a sick fear of his own imagination. "Draw your weapon! Stop! Stop!" In a split second, before Marcus Jones had even pulled his phone out of his pocket, before he had even recovered from the officer's frantic reaction, Hanson acted with deadly speed. He didn't even try to figure out what was in Jones's pocket. He didn't give any of the other warnings that were required by procedure. His reflexes, distorted by hatred and power, took over. He pulled out the Glock 19 pistol from his waistband, pointed it at Marcus Jones, and without hesitation, pulled the trigger. Bang! The 9mm bullet left the barrel at a terrifying speed, hitting Marcus Jones in the abdomen from just a few meters away. The powerful impact caused him to stagger back, his back hitting the side of the Lexus. His face was filled with utter shock, his eyes wide as he stared at the policeman in disbelief. The pain was excruciating, tearing through his body. He clutched the bleeding wound, trying to stand, but his legs no longer obeyed his control. He fell to his knees, then collapsed completely on the warm asphalt under the fading sunset. The black cell phone flew from his loosely held right hand, landing next to the pool of blood that was beginning to spread across the impeccably clean pavement. His last breath came out weakly, then stopped. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Aurelius Jones, a distinguished military officer, a dutiful son, died unjustly and indignantly on the streets of the very country he had sworn to protect. Officer Daniel Hanson stood there, his gun still cocked, the barrel smoking thinly. He looked down at the body lying motionless on the ground, then down at the gun in his hand. The twisted satisfaction vanished instantly, replaced by emptiness and a cold feeling that began to take over his entire body. He had just shot the man. He knew he had gone too far. He knew he would have to face the consequences. But at that moment, in his prejudiced mind, he could not yet grasp that his victim was not some nameless nigger, and that the consequences he was about to face would be beyond his worst imaginings. The sound of a gunshot, even just one, shattered the quiet of Summit Ridge Estates. It echoed between the stone walls and the large gardens, a sound both dissonant and violent. In several nearby homes, window shades were cautiously drawn back. Curious, worried, and frightened faces peered out. Within a minute, at least 2, then 3, 911 calls were made almost simultaneously, reporting gunshots and the sight of a man lying on the street next to a black Lexus, with a police car parked nearby. Daniel Hanson, after a few seconds of initial shock, began to act on instinct, the instinct of a criminal to cover up and protect himself. His hands shook as he raised the radio to his mouth, trying to make his voice sound calm and professional, but he couldn't quite hide his panic. 7 Adam 12. Dispatch, this is 7 Adam 12 reporting shots fired. His voice cracked slightly. Location at the intersection of Willow Lane and Summit Drive. There is a subject. Subject is acting hostile, not complying with commands. Has pulled what appears to be a weapon from his jacket. I was forced to fire in self-defense. Requesting an ambulance and level 3 support immediately. Repeat, requesting an ambulance and support. He ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced down at the body and the black cell phone lying nearby. He had to quickly construct a solid story in his head. Yes, this man was suspicious. He had resisted orders. He had pulled out what looked like a gun, and he, Officer Hansen, had acted according to procedure to protect his own life. He convinced himself that even though the small part of his mind that remained screamed that it was a blatant lie. Within 5 minutes, sirens wailed from multiple directions, getting closer. 2 more patrol cars and an Oakmont Fire Department ambulance rushed to the scene, their red and blue lights flashing, illuminating a street that had been fading into the twilight. The newly arrived officers cautiously stepped out of their cars, guns at the ready, scanning the scene. They saw a horrifying sight, a large black man lying motionless in a growing pool of blood on the pavement, next to a luxury Lexus. A few feet away, their colleague, Officer Daniel Hansen, was leaning against his patrol car, his face pale, his breathing rapid, trying to appear calm but his hands still shaking. "Damn it, Dan. What the hell is going on here?" Sergeant Al Ramirez, the shift commander and Hansen's immediate superior, was the first to approach him, his voice filled with urgency and concern. He resisted, Sergeant," Hansen stammered, repeating the prepared story in his head. "I stopped him for suspicious behavior, asked him to get out. He refused and pulled something out of his jacket. Looked like a small pistol. I had no choice. I had to defend myself." He tried to avoid Sergeant Ramirez's questioning gaze. While Sergeant Ramirez was trying to get more information from Hansen and directing other officers to secure the scene, with yellow tape in place, paramedics from the ambulance quickly approached the victim. They knelt down next to Marcus Jones, checking his pulse and breathing. The hope of survival was extremely slim. There was too much blood. They quickly performed emergency measures on the spot, chest compressions, trying to stop the bleeding, intubation, before urgently loading him onto a stretcher and transferring him to the ambulance. Meanwhile, as part of the initial investigation at the scene of an officer-involved shooting, Sergeant Ramirez needed to identify the victim. He signaled another officer to collect the surrounding evidence, including a black cell phone lying in a pool of blood. Ramirez carefully put on rubber gloves, approached the body, and gently checked the pockets. In the back pocket, he found a thick brown leather wallet. He took a few steps back and opened the wallet under the light of his flashlight. Inside were a few US dollars, a few credit cards in the name of Marcus A. Jones, and a few small, slightly old family photos, a pretty woman and 2 smiling children. Then he flipped to the clear plastic compartment that usually held identification. A Virginia driver's license appeared, complete with information. Marcus Aurelius Jones, address, Alexandria, Virginia. His birth date indicated he was about 50 years old. But what made Sergeant Ramirez, a Marine veteran who had served in Iraq, freeze his blood was the card just below the license. It was a United States military identification card, a white card with a photo and information printed clearly. Ramirez read the words on the card over and over again, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Name, Jones, Marcus A. Rank, Lieutenant Colonel 05. Lieutenant Colonel Branch. U.S. Army Unit. Organization, Department of Defense, Army Lieutenant Colonel. On duty at the Department of Defense, Pentagon. Ramirez felt his throat dry. He looked up at the ambulance that was about to leave, then back at Officer Daniel Hansen, who was still trying to act like the victim, the reluctant hero in the self-defense story he was telling the other officers. A chill ran down Ramirez's spine. He understood immediately the gravity of the situation. This was not just a police shooting of a civilian. This was not just a case with a racially charged element. This was the murder of a high-ranking U.S. military officer, a serving officer working at the heart of the nation's military. The fallout from this incident would extend far beyond the Oakmont Police Department. It would extend to Washington, D.C., to the Pentagon, and could trigger a political and legal crisis at the highest levels. Ramirez immediately turned away, out of earshot of Hansen and the other officers. He pulled out his own radio and switched to a secure command-only channel. His voice was low, tense, and serious as he requested immediate access to Chief David Miller. He gave a brief account of the shooting, the victim's critical condition, and most importantly, the identity and military rank of the man Officer Hansen had just shot. Even from a distance, Daniel Hansen was sensitive enough to notice the sudden change in Sergeant Ramirez's demeanor and the tense atmosphere that permeated the scene. He could faintly hear the haunting keywords from his superior's radio call: Lieutenant Colonel, Pentagon, Department of Defense. Extremely serious situation. At this point, Hansen's initial confusion officially turned into utter terror. Cold sweat poured down his forehead and the back of his shirt. His legs began to shake uncontrollably. He had not just killed one man, he had killed a man whose death would enrage a huge power apparatus. He knew at that moment that his life and career were completely over. The only thing he could hope for now was to avoid the worst outcome. The ambulance, siren blaring, tore through the falling night as it sped toward Oakmont Medical Center. Inside, medical staff were doing everything they could to save Lieutenant Colonel Jones's life. But the wound was too severe. The bullet had severely damaged several vital organs and caused acute blood loss. At the hospital, a team of top surgeons was mobilized and on standby. They rushed him into the emergency operating room, beginning a battle for his life that lasted for hours. News of the incident and the patient's unusual identity prompted the hospital leadership to report it to higher authorities. But all the efforts of the medical team were ultimately in vain. At 9:17 p.m. that night, the brave heart of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Aurelius Jones stopped beating. He breathed his last on the operating table, far from his family, far from his unit, ending a life of dedication by a senseless and prejudiced act of violence. News of Lieutenant Colonel Jones's death, along with the initial details of the tragic circumstances of the shooting, an unjustified traffic stop, racist insults, and the untimely shooting as he attempted to use his phone, struck not just the town of Oakmont. Through rapidly functioning military and government channels, it traveled at breakneck speed, hundreds of miles, straight to the cold marble halls of power at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. When news of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jones's death was confirmed and fully reported to the highest levels of leadership at the Pentagon, it caused not only shock and grief, but also an outpouring of rage, a collective outrage rarely expressed publicly by senior military officials. Marcus Jones was more than a number on the payroll. He was a respected officer, a friend, and a mentor to generations of younger officers. He represented the best of the United States Army: discipline, honor, courage, and dedication. His brutal and senseless murder by a local police officer, in circumstances that were clearly motivated by racial profiling, was an intolerable affront to him, his family, and the entire Army. In his large office overlooking the Potomac River, 4-star General James Harrison, Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, who had known and worked with Marcus Jones for more than 20 years, received his final call. The old general's battle-worn, stoic face flushed with anger, his blue eyes flashing beneath his bushy eyebrows. He slammed the phone down on the desk, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Unbelievable! Unacceptable!" General Harrison roared, his usually calm voice now hoarse with anger. He paced the room, his hands clenched behind his back. Marcus, shot dead in the street like an animal, just because he was black, by a local sheriff, in this country, the country he swore to protect with his life. God damn it, we can't let this go. General Harrison's fury quickly spread throughout the highest levels of the Army and the Department of Defense. Emergency meetings were called that night. The decision was swift and decisive. The Pentagon would not directly intervene in the criminal investigation and prosecution, which was the responsibility of the civilian legal system. But they would use every resource, every political and legal influence at their disposal to ensure that justice for Lieutenant Colonel Jones was done as fully, severely, and as quickly as possible. They would not allow this case to be covered up, delayed, or handled in a cursory manner. Immediately, the Pentagon's power apparatus swung into action. General Harrison personally called the governor of the state where Oakmont is located, expressing the Defense Department's deep concern and extreme concern about the incident. Similar calls, with clear and unambiguous messages, were made by other senior generals to the mayor of Oakmont, to the senators and representatives representing the state and the district, asking them to ensure a transparent and fair investigation. An official letter was sent to the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., asking the Office of Civil Rights and the FBI to investigate whether there were any federal civil rights violations in the case. The implicit but well-understood message was, the Pentagon was watching every move, and they would not accept anything less than the absolute truth and justice. The pressure from one of the most powerful organizations in the world was beginning to weigh on the small town of Oakmont. In Oakmont, Sheriff David Miller and District Attorney Isabella Rossi felt the heat of Washington, D.C. coming down on them. Their office phones and personal cell phones rang nonstop. They fielded calls from the governor's office, from senators' aides, and even direct calls from generals they had previously only seen on TV. The pressure was intense and unprecedented. Chief Miller, a seasoned and politically savvy man, knew that there was no room for blind cover-ups or protecting subordinates. The reputation of the Oakmont Police Department and his own was at stake. He immediately ordered the Internal Affairs, IA Division, to conduct the investigation into the shooting involving Officer Hansen with the highest priority, utmost care, and absolute transparency. He also reluctantly accepted a request from the Pentagon to allow investigators from the Army Criminal Investigation Command, Army CID, access to the files and to participate as official observers in the IA investigation. This was a rare move reflecting the seriousness and capitulation of the military to pressure. The IA investigation, under close scrutiny from multiple parties, quickly exposed Daniel Hansen's false testimony. His self-defense narrative fell apart in the face of undeniable physical evidence. The victim's cell phone was found at the scene, with no sign of another weapon. The autopsy determined that the bullet had been fired at close range into the abdomen, with no signs of a struggle. Hansen's body cam had been suspiciously turned off shortly before the incident, which in itself was a serious breach of protocol and raised suspicions of a cover-up. Furthermore, testimony from witnesses living across the street confirmed that they had only heard Hansen shouting and then gunshots, with no sign of an attack or resistance from the victim. Faced with increasingly clear evidence and increasing political and military pressure, District Attorney Isabella Rossi, a smart, sharp, and ambitious female lawyer, realized that this was a fateful case. It not only required justice for the victim and his family, but also a great opportunity for her career. She could not let this case go unpunished. After her team gathered enough initial evidence, Ms. Rossi held a grand press conference, attracting national media attention. Standing before a swarm of cameras and microphones, Ms. Rossi, her face solemn and her voice firm, announced, "After carefully reviewing the initial evidence in the heartbreaking case that resulted in the death of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jones, the Oakmont County District Attorney's Office has decided to prosecute Officer Daniel Hansen for the most serious crime under our state's law, first-degree murder. We believe that Officer Hansen's actions were willful, premeditated, and motivated by hate. Given the extremely serious nature of this case, we will also consider seeking the death penalty against the defendant." The announcement that a police officer would be charged with first-degree murder and considered for the death penalty caused a real stir, but also received strong support from an outraged public and especially from the military community. The fierce legal battle officially began. Amid the media and legal storm, Lieutenant Colonel Jones's widow, Eleanor Jones, emerged as a symbol of grief, dignity, and determination to seek justice. She flew to Oakmont from Virginia with her 2 adult children to attend to her husband's funeral and closely follow the case. Making her first public appearance at a solemn memorial service held at a local church, attended by many city, state, and military officials, Eleanor, dressed in a simple black outfit, gave a short but touching speech. She did not cry, but spoke in a choked but firm voice about her wonderful husband, a brave soldier, a loving father, a loyal partner, a model citizen. Marcus lived a meaningful life, dedicated to his family and his country. she said, her eyes fixed straight ahead. He believed in justice, in honor, in equality. He fought for those values in faraway places around the world. And yet, in the end, he was brutally and unjustly taken from his homeland by the very hatred and prejudice he fought against. We are not seeking revenge. We are seeking justice. Justice for Marcus, so that his death will not be in vain, so that no other wife, mother, or child will have to endure this terrible pain. Eleanor's speech went viral. The image of a strong Black woman, in pain but not defeated, inspired and received deep sympathy from the public. In particular, the military and veterans community across the United States expressed unconditional support for the Jones family. Major veterans organizations, military lobby groups, and civil rights activists spoke out together, held vigils, raised funds for legal support for the family, and created a wave of strong public pressure, demanding the harshest punishment for Daniel Hansen. The tragic story of Lieutenant Colonel Jones is no longer just an isolated case. It has become a call to fight against injustice and demand real change. Months later, Officer Daniel Hansen's first-degree murder trial officially began in Oakmont County Superior Court. From the very first day, the trial became the center of national and international attention. Security outside and inside the courthouse was unprecedented. Major news agencies sent their best reporters to cover the story. Courtroom 1, the largest courtroom, was packed to the brim. The first rows behind the prosecutor's table were always occupied by Eleanor Jones and her 2 children, along with a delegation of senior military officers in full uniform, including General James Harrison on the most important days. Their presence was a silent but powerful reminder of the victim's status and the Pentagon's special attention. Behind them were members of the public, activists, and scores of reporters jostling to take notes and snap photos. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Isabella Rossi herself and a team of the office's best lawyers, presented a tightly constructed case, backed by a trove of irrefutable evidence and witnesses. They meticulously retconned the entire course of events that fateful afternoon, from Hansen's sighting of Jones' Lexus, his unjustified decision to stop the car, the racist and profane comments, to the final moment when Hansen opened fire on Jones for trying to take out his phone. Lieutenant Colonel Jones's cell phone, carefully sealed in an evidence bag, became a focal point. The prosecutor held it up to the jury. "This," Miss Rossi said, her voice firm, "this is the weapon that Officer Hansen claimed to have seen. A cell phone. A phone that Lieutenant Colonel Jones intended to use to record the defendant's misconduct and to call his attorney to protect his civil rights. And for that action, he paid with his life." They called in forensic experts to analyze the wound, the angle of the shot, the distance. They called in experts on police use of force procedures to prove that Hansen's actions were completely wrong, unnecessary, and in violation of every rule he had been trained in. They called in a witness who lived across the street, who clearly heard Hansen yelling and confirmed that there was no sign of a struggle before the gunshot. They even presented evidence of previous incidents where Hansen had been reprimanded for his arrogant and discriminatory behavior, to prove that this was not a spontaneous act but the result of a long-standing pattern. The testimony of the police officers who were at the scene after the shooting was also crucial. Although many were uncomfortable and reluctant to testify against their colleagues, under oath and sharp questioning by the prosecution, they were forced to acknowledge Hansen's state of panic, his initially inconsistent explanations, and the lack of evidence at the scene that suggested a struggle or self-defense. But perhaps the most moving and powerful moment for the jury was when Eleanor Jones took the stand. She told of her 30 years of happy marriage to Marcus, of his silent sacrifices for the country, of his love for his family. She told of the fateful phone call informing her of her husband's accident, of the heartbreaking pain of learning that he had passed away. She showed no hatred or agitation, only immense pain and a simple but powerful request. "Please give my husband justice. Please let justice be done." Tears rolled down the cheeks of many in the courtroom, including a few jurors. The defense, led by a veteran police attorney, tried hard to defend their client. They focused on portraying Daniel Hansen as an ordinary police officer who was under intense pressure and who acted in a high-stress, fast-moving situation in which he genuinely believed his life was in danger. They tried to focus on Jones's unexpected hand reaching into his jacket pocket, arguing that Hansen could not tell whether it was a phone or a weapon. They tried to downplay the racial slur, saying it was a heated exchange that did not reflect Hansen's character. They called witnesses who were Hansen's colleagues to speak favorably of him. However, given the weight of the physical evidence, the testimony of objective witnesses, the unique status of the victim, and the prevailing climate of outrage, the defense's efforts appear weak and unconvincing. The momentary misunderstanding argument is unlikely to hold water when confronted with Hansen's initial unreasonable stop and his sustained insults. After weeks of intense trial with hundreds of pieces of evidence presented and dozens of witnesses questioned, both the prosecution and defense delivered dramatic closing arguments. The 12 jurors, 7 women and 5 men, racially diverse after a lengthy and careful selection process, then retired to the jury room to deliver their verdict that would decide Daniel Hansen's fate. The entire nation seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Television news channels broadcast live news from outside the courthouse. After 2.5 days of deliberation, a relatively short time for such a complex murder case, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the 12 jurors filed into their seats, their faces expressionless. Daniel Hansen sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his hands clasped together on the table, his body trembling slightly. Eleanor Jones sat bolt upright in the front row, clutching the hands of her 2 children. The judge called for order. He turned to the foreman of the jury, a middle-aged woman. "Madam Foreman, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the woman replied, her voice clear. "On the charge of first-degree murder against the defendant, Daniel Hansen, what does the jury find?" The foreman of the jury took a deep breath, looked straight ahead, and read aloud the results from the paper in his hand. "We, the jury, having considered all the evidence, find the defendant, Daniel Hansen, guilty." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Daniel Hansen slumped into his chair as if drained of strength, his hands covering his face. Eleanor Jones closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking as the tears she had held back finally fell. The military officers remained stoic, but relief was evident on their faces. Justice had been served. The trial quickly moved to the second phase, sentencing. Having been convicted of first-degree murder, under state law, Daniel Hansen faced only 2 possibilities: life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty. District Attorney Isabella Rossi took the stand again, eloquently presenting the aggravating factors to convince the judge to impose the maximum sentence. She reiterated the brutal nature of the murder, the obvious racial motive, the blatant abuse of power by a man wearing a badge, the betrayal of public trust. She emphasized that the victim was a high-ranking military officer, a man who had devoted his life to his country, unjustly murdered while completely defenseless. She spoke of the irreparable pain of the Jones family. "Your Honor," she concluded, her voice emotional but no less firm, "justice demands, and this community demands, a sentence that fits this heinous crime. We believe in this case the only sentence appropriate is the death penalty." Defense attorneys also had the opportunity to present mitigating factors. They talked about Hansen's difficult childhood, his family, his years of police service, and his ability to reform. They begged the court to spare Hansen's life, arguing that a life sentence was a severe enough punishment. Finally, after hearing both sides' arguments in full, it was the turn of the presiding judge, an elderly white judge with a reputation for being fair but strict, to render his final judgment. He took the time to carefully review the case file, the evidence, the applicable law, and the aggravating and mitigating factors presented. He asked Daniel Hansen to stand. Hansen staggered to his feet, his face drained of color, his eyes vacant. The judge looked straight at the defendant, then began to read his verdict. His voice echoed, solemn in the silent courtroom. "The defendant's actions that day," the judge said, his voice becoming especially stern, "were cruel, unconscionable, and utterly unjustifiable. The defendant allowed blind hatred and prejudice to direct his actions, leading to an irreversible tragedy. This crime demands the most proportionate punishment possible under the law to affirm the value of the life lost, to deter future acts of similar nature, and to achieve full justice. Then the judge took a deep breath, looked straight at Daniel Hansen, who was standing there frozen, and declared loudly, "After considering all the factors by the authority vested in it by the laws of this state, the court sentences the defendant Daniel Hansen to the penalty of death." Death sentence. The courtroom held its breath. A death sentence for a police officer for killing someone in the line of duty is extremely rare, almost unheard of in this state, and very rare in the entire United States. It was a shocking decision, the strongest message one could send. Daniel Hansen let out a desperate, inhuman scream, then collapsed completely, being held down and dragged away by the burly court security guards. Eleanor Jones sobbed on her son's shoulder, her tears no longer just of grief, but of relief from a terrible burden that had been weighing on her family for months. Justice, however belated and painful, had finally been served at its highest level. News of Daniel Hansen's death sentence spread around the world in minutes, making headlines across every media outlet. It was met with mixed reactions: cheers from supporters of the Jones family, the military community, civil rights activists, and those who believed it was a historic victory for justice, but also opposition from death penalty opponents in a small section of the police force who felt the sentence was too harsh and influenced by political pressure. At the Pentagon, General James Harrison held a press conference shortly after the verdict was announced. He stood before the American and Army flags, his face solemn. "Today, the justice system has spoken," he said. "Justice has been served for Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jones, a brave soldier, a beloved son of the United States Army, and for his family. This harsh sentence sends an unmistakable message that no one is above the law, and that the United States military will always stand up for its soldiers and seek justice for them at all costs. However, this victory cannot bring Marcus back to us. We will forever remember his service, his courage, and his sacrifice. We pledge to continue to work tirelessly to root out racism and injustice from our ranks, and to help build a country where every citizen, regardless of color or background, is treated with dignity and respect." Eleanor Jones, in a brief statement to the media, expressed gratitude to the district attorney, the jury, the judge, and all who have supported her family during this difficult time. "No sentence can truly heal our wounds or bring Marcus back," she wrote. "But we hope that the justice served today will be an important step forward. May my husband's tragic death not be in vain, but serve as a powerful wake-up call that will spur real and necessary changes in how law enforcement operates, in education about equality, and in the ongoing effort to build a more just and safe society for all." The story of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jones and Officer Daniel Hansen ends with a death sentence, a remarkable and controversial outcome. It is a testament to how the machinery of justice can sometimes work, with enough pressure and attention. But it also leaves behind complex echoes, thorny questions about the nature of justice, about equality before the law, and about the deep cracks that still exist in modern American society. The Pentagon's call for justice for one soldier helped bring justice, but the fight for true justice for all is still a long way off. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.